I'm just looking at this hardcover book about Disneyland. It's called Disneyland, A Celebration of New Magic and Fond Memories, and it's by my friends, Tim O'Day and Kevin Kidney. This was published in 2014, just in time for 2015, the 60th anniversary of Disneyland. And there have been a number of these hardcovers printed over the years, and they take beautiful photography and show you all the wonders of Walt Disney's Magic Kingdom. But I wasn't really going to talk about the hardcovers today. I was going to talk about what I call the guidebooks. Now, usually when we talk about the guidebooks, we're thinking maybe about these, which are guide maps. These are the ones you can get for free at the main gate and throughout the Disneyland Resort. Here we have one about Disney California Adventure, and we have Disneyland Park itself, and these have little maps and guides inside. And usually that's what people might think of when you say guidebooks. And then there's also these handbills, which are published up a few times a week to give you the overview of special events like parades and shows. So in between the extremes of the hardcover sort of art books and these handout pamphlets or brochures or handbills are what we call the Pictorial Souvenir albums. And these are a really fascinating look at the park over the years. Quite a number of these have been published over the years, and each one captures the park in the year that it indicates. So it's really a fascinating look back at Disneyland, right from the start. Disneyland, of course, opened in 1955, and the very first Pictorial Souvenir album was published that very year. And that's what we're going to take a closer look at today. Now, in my own collection, I do not have the very first one, which is unfortunate because it's one of the more fascinating ones. It was published in 1955 before the park was opened. Why? So that it would be available on opening day. And because of that, it does not contain any photographs. It's all illustrations and art and concept art. So it's really a fascinating artifact. Walt Disney himself explained it in his foreword to that Pictorial Souvenir album. He says, "The first edition illustrations on these pages show buildings and exhibits in artist rendering stage. That was so we could have the booklet ready for our early visitors. But Disneyland will always be building and growing and adding new things, new ways of having fun, of learning things and sharing the many exciting adventures which may be experienced here in the company of family and friends." It's very fascinating and interesting to hear his own words in 1955, really before the park even opened. That was quickly replaced also in 1955 by this, one of the most famous of these pictorial souvenir books, which is called the Picture Souvenir Book of Disneyland in Natural Color. And here at last we have photographs of the park in its earliest days. So on the cover we have this very famous photograph of Walt Disney pointing out the famous illustration of Disneyland painted by Disney legend Peter Allen Shaw. It was painted on a storyboard, so it's quite large. Gave an early but still very finished look at Disneyland before it was completed. And it's very interesting to note that it's called natural color to indicate in the days when color photography was still not that common that this was going to be a book full of photographs that would show you what Disneyland really looked like. If we look inside, naturally there's a map at the beginning so that you could take this around Disneyland with you, and it would show you photographs of Disneyland in its earliest days. Remember, this is 1955, the opening year. We have some really wonderful photographs of Disneyland before the trees grew and before the landscaping was finished. And needless to say, there were attractions that hadn't even been added yet. Attractions that had not yet been added and attractions that are no longer there. Tomorrowland has gone through a number of major revisions over the years. Now, as I said, this was published in 1955, but this edition that I hold in my hand is not from 1955. I bought this in 2005, which was the 50th anniversary of Disneyland. It was republished at that time to celebrate the 50th anniversary. So naturally, I snapped it up because I really wanted to have this in my collection, and it was a good way to get it, because obviously this in good condition from 1955 is quite expensive and quite the artifact. The next one I have here in my collection is the complete guide to Adventureland, Tomorrowland, Fantasyland, Frontierland, Main Street USA, the realms of Disneyland. As you can see, larger, more deluxe than the natural cover version. And this had even more photographs, also coupled with some art. We can take a look inside. Again, there's a foreword by Walt Disney, as there was in the very first one, but this time it's just using the dedication of Disneyland. That, of course, can be found in the plaque in Town Square in Main Street, USA, near the flagpole. And then we have this wonderful art showing a kind of cartoon version of Disneyland in map form. And this art has been used quite a bit over the years. Everyone loves it. It's been republished in various ways over the years because everybody does love it. Once again, we have photographs. Really wonderful. And these pictorial souvenir albums were, of course, sold throughout Disneyland, certainly on Main Street, but other places too throughout the park. The interesting thing about this particular pictorial souvenir album is that it was published in 3 different versions. The first was in 1956, and then there were 2 in 1957. This edition from my own collection is one of the 2 from 1957. All 3 are pretty identical. There are some subtle differences as the park was changing in those years. But it's really one of the most fascinating ones that you can look at. Following the 1956-1957 edition was an even more elaborate pictorial souvenir guide from 1960. And one of the most interesting things about it is that Walt Disney himself is on the cover at this point. And of course it was the Disneyland TV series, which premiered in 1954, that made Walt Disney a familiar face. He came into viewers' living rooms every single week and was a very affable host. Who better than Walt Disney to host the Disneyland TV series? So here we have his star power, as it were, on the cover. I really like this this edition. Again, lots of photographs. And this time, photos of Walt Disney was added to sort of personalize each land of the park. So for example, here we have Walt in one of the Peter Pan's Flight pirate ships that takes you through the attraction. For Tomorrowland, a photo of Walt in one of the Autopia cars. And it really helps it feel that Walt is guiding you through Disneyland himself. There's also at this point some wonderful words from Walt Disney himself describing each of the Disneyland realms. So those have been used over the years and they're really fantastic. Now I happen to know that this particular edition I hold in my hand, although published in 1960, was purchased in 1961 because it came with this special guest card which is dated April 1st, 1961. And this is from the Magic Kingdom Club, which used to be quite famous. And what this was is that companies and businesses could join this Magic Kingdom Club, and then their employees could get discounts when they went to Disneyland. Here we have Main Street and a photo of Walt Disney in what must have been his favorite attraction, Disneyland Railroad, since he, of course, was a great lover of trains, and the whole idea of Disneyland sprang in part from his love of trains. Now, another fascinating element of this particular pictorial souvenir guide is the whole idea of looking to the future. What were the future attractions going to be? And here it's very lovely that it's called Dreaming. And it tells you about some of the coming attractions that were on the drawing board at that point. Interestingly enough, none of these really came to be, with the exception of the Haunted Mansion, which is here called the Haunted House, in this famous art by Sam McKim and Ken Anderson. This is the famous art that Walt saw. It's exactly like the exterior of the Haunted Mansion ended up being, except that it's not quite so spooky looking, and so perhaps we might say run down if you really look at it closely, as we kind of think of haunted houses as being. Walt didn't want anything looking shabby in his park, so the Haunted Mansion as constructed is pristine and beautiful looking as it is to this day. And here it's called the Haunted House. We also have concept art for Chinatown, Liberty Street, Adventures in Science, and none of these really came to be at Disneyland. So it's really a fascinating look at the dreaming that was happening and plans for the Magic Kingdom that Walt Disney had. It's very interesting because it says many other attractions, entertaining, fanciful, historical, and educational, are still in the, quote, dreaming, close quote, stages. While actual dates of their installation cannot be promised, some of them may be here for you and your family to enjoy on your next visit to Disneyland. On this page are drawings which show some of the dreams Walt Disney has for Disneyland's future. So they really played that very well. No promises, and they knew that some of these would evolve, change into something else, or maybe not even be built at all, but these were in the dreaming stages. So really a fantastic pictorial souvenir guide from 1960 and 1961. That kind of tells us how these were published. They might have been published in a particular year, and then they were republished the next few years until the next pictorial souvenir album was created. Which brings us to the very next one from 1965. 1965 was, of course, the 10th anniversary of Disneyland, and as it was called, the Tencennial, a term that I just love. And this is what was published at that time, something very special, obviously. Take a look at this. Never before, and never again, would there be a pictorial album that was so elaborate and so big as this one. So I feel that this is the most special of all of these pictorial souvenir books. Once again, we have Walt Disney on the cover. On the back, we have some wonderful shots of guests, and it's simply called Disneyland is for People. Inside this pictorial souvenir book, we have, of course, a foreword from Walt Disney. Lots of art, again, and, you guessed it, lots of photographs. Here we see Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln. These were added to Disneyland And going along with that, we have a spread on Walt Disney's It's a Small World, which of course was introduced at the New York World's Fair and then moved to Disneyland in 1966. One of the most favorite of all Disneyland attractions. So we can see from this pictorial souvenir book, this was a big deal. Here's Tomorrowland. And the other realms are represented as well. But Tomorrowland brings us to an interesting point. At this point, plans were well underway for a complete redesign of Tomorrowland, which premiered in 1967 and has come to be called Tomorrowland 67 for obvious reasons. Well, that was previewed here. Again, we have concept art, which is just fantastic. And an interesting thing is this central image, which is by John Hench, and then this image up here shows Space Mountain. Space Mountain is, of course, one of Disneyland's favorite attractions, and it did not premiere in 1967 along with New Tomorrowland. Space Mountain is also shown in this art down here. So the promise of Space Mountain, an indoor roller coaster that was created by Walt Disney himself, or so envisioned, was a very big deal. And it was kind of put on hold because the technology was not ready to have such an elaborate attraction in 1967. Here we have a preview of New Orleans Square, which was not open in 1965 when this was published. Therefore, this is a preview. That premiered in 1966, but it certainly gave some wonderful indications of what it was going to be like, and some wonderful copy here describing it. And interestingly, down here, art by Mark Davis, quite early in fact, of Pirates of the Caribbean. And here we have the beginning of that attraction, the Blue Bayou, which is the restaurant here that guests, of course, float by on their way through the attraction. Wonderful Herb Ryman art. This is just priceless. Now, you might recall that I said there's never been a more elaborate pictorial souvenir book than this one, and we have this sort of centerfold that kind of proves that. Aside from the usual photographs of the different realms of Disneyland, all of which are wonderful, we have this centerfold. This centerfold both celebrates Disneyland as it is, as it was, and as it will be. So here here it says Disneyland will never be completed along the top. And it shows us some construction photos of the Matterhorn, which opened in 1959. But here we have the Haunted Mansion, more concept art. This should look familiar to you. And an explanation of what it would be. So another very interesting aspect that people are always fascinated with is that the exterior of the Haunted Mansion was constructed in 1963. This book is from 1965. Haunted Mansion, the attraction, did not open until 1969. But the building, that wonderful, beautiful mansion, was sitting there enticing guests since 1963. But then there's more to this centerfold than meets the eye. And I really like how this is so beautifully plussed, to use the Disney term, because we can open this to see these wonderful photographs of Disneyland over the years, very appropriate for the 10th anniversary, for the Tencennial. And across the top it says Disneyland then, now, and tomorrow. So simultaneously a look back and a look forward in a very elaborate style. And that leads us to these previews that we've already talked about. How fantastic is that? We have the special section, Disneyland After Dark, and special events, which is about some of the concerts and some of the performers. And this wonderfully designed food and drink and special shows and exhibits, which is all done with these sort of icons and these wonderful symbols and this wonderful art. Now, there were other pictorial souvenir albums or books published over the years beyond this, but that is the climax of this, because as I said, this was never topped. And this, of course, was the last one published in Walt Disney's lifetime, because, of course, sadly, he died in 1966. This particular pictorial souvenir album set up a time of fantastic growth for Disneyland, all of which had been established by Walt Disney himself. That includes, as we've talked about, New Orleans Square, Pirates of the Caribbean, the Haunted Mansion, and New Tomorrowland, Tomorrowland 67. So to bring this to a close, I'd like to read to you a few words from Walt Disney himself, which comes from the foreword from that very first pictorial souvenir album, which was prepared and published before Disneyland even opened in 1955. This is what Walt said. "What you see in Disneyland represents the combined efforts of hundreds of artists, architects, scientists, expert craftsmen, and engineers who have helped us carry out a long-cherished dream. The park playground fulfills a wish that those of us who like the same things might more closely share the pleasures I have had in exploring the paths of fable and folklore, of nature and science, and historical legend on the screen and television. So, the opening of Disneyland, where visitors of every age and circumstance can learn joyously from fact and live closely with fantasy, has been for me, as I hope it has been for you, a most happy event, a dream come true." Inspiring words that still hold true for what is still known as Walt Disney's Magic Kingdom. So just a reminder, for anyone who would like a transcript of today's show, please send 10 cents in coin to Merkle Press, New York, New York. And we'll see you again soon.